Hello everybody. This is the video I promised you all. Just a really quick sort of walkthrough of some motivation frameworks that might be helpful to just sort of get us all on a similar page, not the same page, while we talk about what makes motivation work, particularly in educational settings, and to just sort of help us all maybe have some on-ramps to talk about motivation and to bring our own experiences, sort of to integrate our own experiences with what some of the research and other writing has to say about motivation. So, what does a demotivated student look like? I use this image when I did my student motivation, when I just teach a regular workshop on student motivation, because frankly, at the time when I made that workshop, that's how I felt, like this kid here over the log, just demotivated. I couldn't get myself going, and I think that our students often feel like this for lots of different reasons. So, but it is useful to start to think about what does a demotivated student look like, partly because that can help us start to articulate the symptoms and also understand from our different perspectives what we see in students that seem to be demotivated. And then also we can start to map some of that onto some frameworks. Some of the things that we might see in students that are demotivated: they're frustrated, they're bored, they're fatigued, they're stressed, resistant, withdrawn, angry, and apathetic. And just for me personally, the most difficult of these is the apathetic piece, because at least if there's some energy, we can maybe move that energy in a different direction. But it's difficult to encounter students who seem to have just no emotion toward our class at all. Whether that's resisting, at least we have something to work with. Stressed, we kind of have some ideas about how to maybe talk with students around that. So apathy is a sort of a critical question, at least for me, and also for one of the people we're going to talk about who has a framework, is Dave Stewart Jr., and he actually asks the question, how does apathy feel in the heart of a student? And that was really important for me when I started thinking about this, to try to imagine what it feels like, and then also to realize that it probably doesn't feel good, and our students who are having difficulty being motivated to do the things that they feel they're expected or required to do are not having a good time. It doesn't feel good to be in that space. And apathy in your heart is a painful feeling. And so that to me grounds me in a different sort of empathetic place for my students. So lots of people have been talking about motivation for humans in general, but also specifically in the educational context. And we're going to look at, I've linked to some of these things, and we'll be talking more about them. But today we'll look at self-determination theory, why students resist learning, and then the will to learn. So the work of those from those three. And I've seen recently some really interesting things in the Radical Hope book by Kevin Gannon. He came and spoke at for CAS recently. And then I've just been reading Sarah Rose Kavanaugh's Mind Over Monsters, which seems to be a lot about mental health, but there's a whole section in the middle that really talks about motivation. So I've linked a couple of those chapters into our Moodle course also. And all of these resources you can find in the Moodle course, except the Will to Learn, because that one's not available in our library yet. I'm working on that. And I'll also include links to resources to get to some of the writings from these people. But let's start with self-determination theory. You may have heard about this. Edward Deci and Richard, with a typo, Ryan, that I should not be capitalized, in 1985, they sort of first started talking about self-determination theory. And in a very, very short and definitely not expert summary of this, that self-determination theory is sort of like a macro theory, like a macro theory of human motivation. And under that big theory are 6 mini theories. So they are articulated out to this extent. Now, I'm just going to pause with a caveat to say I am not an expert on self-determination theory. I have kept bumping into it in some of those other books that I showed you on a couple slides ago. And so I looked into it a bit because a lot of people who are contemporary writers in the education space are referring to this when they talk about motivation. So you can see these 6 little sub-theories or mini-theories. Really, it talks about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. That's really a key thing that is sort of explored in these theories. Also the role of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Those are sort of the 3 big areas that a lot of these mini-theories intersect with. So here you have a very busy graphic that sort of tries to encapsulate the whole self-determination theory in one image here. So what you have in the middle, in these small squares here, the rectangles in the middle, is sort of, they call this the continuum of motivation. And so you have on one end completely amotivated. There's no motivation at all, no intention or feeling that you have any control, all the way to the other end, which is people choose to do things because it's pleasurable to them. They don't have any kind of reinforcement or reward. And in the middle here, we have this continuum of other things, from behaviors that are externally regulated all the way to ones that are internally regulated. And then also why students do a thing they do. So this is sort of, in the heart and mind of a student or a person in general. This isn't student specific. What are they doing? So are they controlled or are they more autonomous? So low autonomy and high autonomy down here near the bottom. And is it sort of integrated within them and internalized, or is it something that's really dependent on an outside structure? And as you can see at the very top here, the need for autonomy, competence, and relatedness all go into these basic psychological needs that feed down into motivation. So that's a super summary, non-expert run-through of self-determination theory. The other framework that I think is useful for us is the work of Anton Tolman. He works with other writers, but he's the first author on all of the stuff. And I did link in a podcast featuring Anton Tolman that talked about his book, The Resistance to Learning. So his work has been trying to understand student resistance, and he kind of wants some that kind of breaks down into like forms of student resistance. And he has this integrated model of what makes student resistance happen. So here's his matrix of kinds of student resistance. And this was interesting to me specifically because I hadn't thought about different kinds, not just different kinds of resistance we might encounter, but really what is the student trying to do when they're resisting in these different ways. So as you can see in this table here, the first column is all about asserting autonomy, which we saw from self-determination theory is really important. That autonomy is really one of the 3 critical pieces. So when students are actively resisting, these are some of the things we might see. Remember how we started this little talk with, what does it look like when a student is not motivated? In this case, what does it look like when a student is resisting? And we've probably all of us seen this in our classroom. Active disagreement or arguing, wanting us to rationalize what we're doing, all the way down to making complaints against the teacher. Passive resistance, though, that is a signal that students are trying to assert their autonomy, might be that refusing to come to class, which we talked about in our last meeting. Many of us are seeing absenteeism. They're just not coming to class. And that might be an assertion of autonomy there. They don't want to participate in class. And they might be just sort of sending bad vibes around to other people about a specific professor. All of those, according to Anton Tolman's model here, are students trying to assert their own autonomy, which tells us that they aren't feeling autonomous, and that's something we can do. We can try to work on that. The other column, the far right column here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but I'm going to try anyway, is preserving the self. So that's another thing that they might be trying to do. Either they're trying to accommodate an external influence. We also see that cross-index with self-determination theory quite a bit. And they might be feeling anxiety or fear because they don't feel like they have enough control, which is also related to autonomy. So we've all seen this. They continue to ask for clarification of how they're going to be graded, which is really a pretty strong signal that they're anxious about and that they don't have trust, that it's safe to take risks, or that they understand that they are in safe hands. And then really trying to just continue to that grade grubbing that we all have unfortunately experienced. And by this model, maybe they're trying to preserve their own self. And this is actually an anxiety behavior or a fear behavior. That's all the active stuff we can see. And even passive resistance might just be they don't really want to work with other people. They just don't want to resolve any situations. They just let it go. Or they just don't want to participate in class, or they're withdrawn. And they just don't want to take action and make decisions. This looks more like apathy, I think, to me. And so really, it might not be that they're disengaged and don't want to be in, like, don't care about the class. They may be trying to preserve the self. And that was really an eye-opening opportunity for me. And again, made me sort of, moved me more into an empathetic space for my students when I encountered this. So this is the way Tolman actually defines resistance as an outcome and a state where the student is rejecting learning opportunities. They're actively rejecting that opportunity, or maybe passively rejecting the opportunity because of some systemic factor. There's something else going on, and it's a system, which I think is really interesting and really resonates for me from what I've seen with students. And so here's an image it's a little bit of a busy image, but this is Tolman's model as he has drawn it. So this is his figure with added color, but this is how he lays out the figure of all of these factors are the system that integrate together and have, they integrate with resistance, student resistance. They contribute to it and they feed back and forth. As you can see, all of these arrows, almost all of them have double ends. So this is definitely a dynamic sort of system. So metacognition, how they're thinking, if they've had negative experiences in classrooms before, and most all of us have, how their cognitive development is. And that, of course, is related to metacognition, like where are they in terms of the tasks that they're being asked to do cognitively. What other environment is out there? So their work environment, their family environment, their culture, whether or not they're experiencing racism, or if they have differing abilities, how that they feel that's being accommodated, how welcome they feel in that space. And then other negative classroom experiences they may have had, which, as they said, relates to metacognition. Are they aware of those experiences, and are they able to interact productively with those negative experiences so that they can then take control of their learning and think about how they're thinking in the moment. So as you can see, the ones on the right there are a part of that institutional culture, which may or may not be our institution, right? Because our students bring with them the experiences they've had in other institutions. But all of these factors together, and sort of I think my big takeaway from this is that it's complicated, and does not very, like, only one, I would say 1/5 of this diagram is within the student, and everything else is the student's actual resistance. I guess metacognition and cognitive development are sort of maybe within the student, but the others are outside of the student. And so to think about when we were observing specific behavior with students, it's important to recognize that it's a much bigger thing. We're only seeing some small bit of what's actually happening and what might be, contributing to some of that behavior that the student is exhibiting for us. So the most important thing I've gotten from Tolman's work is this one single statement, which is his encouragement and his sort of claim that we should consider student resistance as a signal that something's happening, and that that's helpful and important because it tells us something about what's happening. The student is, not intentionally perhaps, but that could be a communication coming from the student. And then we can start to figure out what's not working, and then we can start to change it. So that sort of goes toward communication, which to me is very helpful when I'm interacting with maybe challenging things with students. All right, so the last framework that I'm just going to talk about in this hopefully brief, we're only at 15 minutes or so right now. Might be less than that if you're watching me on time and a half or double time. But the last piece of work and sort of framework I want to talk about is really looking at how to positively influence student behavior. Student motivation. So the writer who's been doing a lot of this work that I have encountered, his name is Dave Stewart Jr., and he's actually a high school teacher. As a high school teacher, Dave Stewart Jr. is encountering a lot of very challenging motivational situations. Students who, have really, at that age, often really are ready for or wanting more autonomy, but it's very, at least in my experience as a high school teacher and a high school student, there's not a lot of autonomy when you're 15, 16, 17 years old. Certainly relative to what our students encounter at higher ed. He's writing primarily for, I would say, I think he says a 4th to 12th grade level of educator, like the educator who's teaching 4th to 12th graders. But I everything I've encountered from him, or almost all of it, translates seamlessly to the work that I have done with students and the work I talk about with other faculty. So the big question he asks in his motivation work is, how can we motivate students to do the work and do it with care? Those two pieces are really important to Dave Stewart Jr., but also to us in our work. It's not enough to just have the students comply. We also want them to care about it. And so he has a framework called the 5 Key Beliefs, where he says these 5 things, if we can make progress there, we can positively influence student motivation. And he talks about those at length in his book, The Will to Learn, which came out in 2023. So here is his model for the 5 key beliefs. This is a practical model, and I would just say I find Dave Stewart Jr.'s work very practical. Not scholarly or academic in the sense of, some of the other frameworks we've looked at in this presentation, but absolutely take it out of the box and go try it in your classroom today, kind of practical. And they also resonate with all that I've experienced in, a career of teaching. So he says basically that there are these 5 beliefs. We want the students in their own hearts and minds to believe in credibility of the teacher. And we want them to have beliefs about value. We want them to believe that the work that we're asking them to do is valuable and it matters. It's worth the time that we're asking. We want them to believe that they can improve through smart effort, right? This is Dweck's growth mindset. We also want them to believe that they are capable of success. And those two are very close to each other. And as I've thought through this model a lot of times and read about it many times, it's taken me some time to sort of separate them out. And as he's continued to write about this, he's sort of let them conflate a bit more because they are very related. They're subtly different, but very related. The fact that one can improve through effort, that the effort makes a difference. And then the other piece is, I am personally capable of succeeding at this. And then that top of the pyramid is the idea that a student belongs doing the kind of work that they're doing. As he says right here, people like me do work like this. And we know that belonging is related to motivation in a lot of other models as well. So this very quite simple model, he fleshes it out for a whole book. And I have found that there's some really practical applications in each of these. that he talks about, like, so here are some strategies for working on credibility with your students and trying to positively influence their beliefs about credibility. Basically, how to make your students believe that you're a good teacher. It's important to note that it's not about whether or not you're a good teacher, this piece of the model. It's about whether or not your student perceives that you are. And that's why it's a belief within the student that we're trying to influence. Sometimes that correlates with how well we're doing as teachers, but certainly that's not a direct correlation. We might be very skilled teachers, and if our student doesn't believe that, there are going to be problems with the credibility belief. So here are some strategies. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want you to know that within Dave Stuart Jr.'s work, there are strategies sort of discussed at length. He's a very strategy-focused writer. If you want to try to impact credibility, here are some things you can do. His moments of genuine connection is really smart. Just trying to actually make a connection with every student, even if it's a 30-second to 1-minute connection. And he's teaching more than 100 students a day. So he has figured out how to do this pretty efficiently. To try to put some gentle urgency about what's happening in your class so that your students can perceive that it's important what's happening there. Trying to help students understand the value of what you're asking them to do. He has some strategies there. How to impact that efficacy idea is very helpful. And then the sense of belonging, I think is sort of an interesting approach he has, is this idea of trying to normalize struggle so that students don't feel like when they're encountering struggling, it's just because of them, but that lots of people have struggle, and it's actually a very normal and healthy part of the learning process. So one can, as a teacher, pick any number of these things, but sometimes we can think about what are we seeing in our students and what might that be signaling to us, call back to Tolman, about which of these beliefs the student maybe needs some support in order to sort of be motivated. So one of the most important points I think that Dave Stuart Jr. makes, and I think this is particularly impressive insight for someone who's teaching in high school, where a lot of high school, let's be honest, is about coercing students to do what we want them to do, about coercing compliance. And what he says is that you can't coerce care. You can coerce students into certain behaviors, but you can't coerce them into really caring about what they're doing. And this is a comment that I know came up in our last meeting where folks were really wanting to know the difference between behavior and actually honest motivation. Like, are they really invested in this, or are they just, for whatever external reason, trying to do what we've asked because they're complying? So we can get the behavior, but is that really enough? So I think that really it echoed off of some of our earlier conversation, and maybe that will help lead us into more conversation when we meet again. It's important to know that in Dave Stuart Jr.'s work, his belief is that we're all, as educators, even people involved in education, even if you're not actively teaching, that what we're doing is we work toward the long-term flourishing of students. And that definitely cross-indexes with self-determination theory and lots of the other models that we've seen here. So I end this presentation on a list of some resources that I've referenced. All of these resources are linked in the Moodle course. I'm going to include these resources here in the email when I send you this video, and we can talk about them one-on-one. These might be things that we decide we want to read together and then talk about with more of a focus, or you may want to explore them on your own. But I wanted to let you know that here's just some initial resources that I've encountered and that I referred to and leaned on really as I put this presentation together. So thanks for watching me through 24 minutes. That's, a good 6 minutes longer than I hoped to be, but this gives us a start, and hopefully we'll be able to jump right into a really engaged discussion when we meet together on Tuesday.